Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a few updates on the first month of my book release, and how do we achieve balance in looking at the different theories of skill acquisition. Is it possible to integrate the different approaches? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book. Yes, I've written a new book on skill acquisition called How We Learn to Move, a Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills. It covers the ecological approach to skill from different angles, including practice design, the CLA, coaching, youth sports, designing technology, injury prevention, and using analytics. So I hope you will consider giving it a read. You can find the book on Amazon or by going to perceptionaction.com/book. Now on to the show. Hi, everyone. So we're just coming out of a Thanksgiving break here in the U.S. So what I wanted to do today is kind of a regular episode. I'm just going to talk off the top of my head and record a bit of some of the things going on and some of my thoughts, and we'll get back to regular programming next week. So first of all, I just wanted to mention, it's been roughly 1 month since I released my book. And I just want to say the response has been incredible. And I want to thank everyone for buying it and for people that have left reviews and sent me messages and posted on social media about it. It's just been incredibly humbling and motivating. The reaction is way more than I ever expected in my wildest dreams. So I just wanted to thank everyone for that, and I really hope you're finding it useful. As I said, it's motivating, and I do have a couple other books in the pipeline. I think I've mentioned before, Randy Sullivan and I are working on a book on constraints-led approach to baseball that we're going to publish. And then I do have a follow-up book that I'm starting to sketch out to basically build on this book and talk a bit more about training for elite athletes and kind of how to optimize performance. Right, so that will be coming. I don't know when, but I'm working on it now. The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm really thankful for all the people that have kind of hosted me on their podcast, on my book promotion tour, I call it. Some of the ones I've been on are Better Movement, Spine and Body, Speed and Power, Hack It Out Golf, The Talent Equation, and there's a few more in the pipeline as well. I've posted links to all these in the show notes if you want to have a listen and you're not sick of hearing from me. I've really been impressed. The hosts of these shows, I think I've done a really good job in coming up with some really unique questions. When you listen to someone the same time, they tend to get repetitive, and it's hard for me not to remember what I said on a different podcast. So I think the hosts have done a really good job in getting me to answer some different things. So I really, I thank for that. And as I said, there's a few more coming in the pipeline. I want to mention one more thing about the book. Thank you for those who have left me ratings and reviews on Amazon. If you enjoyed the book, I would greatly, if you've read the book in any way, shape, or form, I'd greatly appreciate if you haven't done so, you would leave me a rating or review. It helps people find it and market it and things like that. So if you have time and you're so inclined, I would greatly appreciate it. Speaking of which, the other issue I wanted to talk about today is the issue, of balance, right? So, the balance, particularly, in my materials I'm putting out on my podcast, on my YouTube channel, my website, and in the book itself, balance between different approaches to skill acquisition, right? And I'm going to do something, probably all authors do this, right? I have all the reviews I have are very glowing. And as I said, very positive on my book, the ones on Amazon, except for one, right? And I'm going to focus on, instead of reading all the positive ones, I'm going to focus on the one. So the title of the review is Poorly Argued Nonsense. And the review is Rob Gray covers the wide array of ways in which movement is linked to sport and indeed general well-being. Sadly, in doing so, craps all over years of work done by other fields to push his own ideas. Some interesting ideas, but comes across far too infallible and dismissive towards other complementary theories. Okay. I've also had someone on Twitter claim my work is word salad and lacks balance. right? So these, a bunch of things, comments, I take these seriously. A bunch of people have told me, and I posted about this on Twitter, the issue of balance between the different approaches and theories. Some people have told me, stop worrying about it. It's your podcast. You can do whatever the heck you want. And, to a certain extent, I agree. But I do, as someone that's trying to educate people and give them information and help them build, I really do want to try to promote, give them a full view of the field, right? And I talked a bit about why, so in my podcast, for example, if you look at my podcast, you'll see early on, in particular, I focused on a lot of theory, ideas from the other side of the coin, right? Imagery. I've interviewed people that do very much information processing approaches to skill. And in my interview with Stu on the talent equation, I talked a bit about why I've kind of changed. You look at the titles of my podcast episodes, for example, almost all the recent ones are ecological something or other, right? And so, I've really kind of focused more, and I've really, if I were trying to maintain balance between the two different theories, I've really shifted into one direction. And obviously, my book is not a balance book, right? It's not trying to describe information processing theories to skill. There's tons of those out there. So, in the episode with Stu, I tried to talk about why. The main reason why I want to focus more on the ecological approach and not also talk about a lot of information processing theories is because I really want to advance the ecological approach. I want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, right? So I want to understand what constraints do we need to manipulate and when, how do they have their effect, so on. And you can only do that, and I want to understand, topics like biointensegrity and deeper topics in dynamical systems, right? And I can only do that so much if I constantly have to be going back to talk about mental models or information processing or Bayes' theories of skill, right? I only have so much time and resources, and in both the materials I put out and in my experiments, right? Studies we do, it's costly to do a training study and to always have to have control groups that get prescriptive instruction, for example, really limits you into what you can find out of the details of the ecological approach. So I want to focus on the ecological approach because I want to advance it and I want to understand it and I want to grow it. That's why I'm putting more eggs in that basket and moving away from kind of keeping a balance of talking about information processing ideas on my podcast, And this is something that I talked about on with, in particular, the field of research on the focus of attention, right? Internal versus external. And I've complained, that because people constantly try to achieve this balance, right? There's so many papers. Here's internal versus external for task X, task Y, task Z, task A, right? Let's stop those, right? We know that external is better than internal, right? Let's get into the subtleties of it. And a good example of this, and you can find a link in the show notes, there's good work done by particular Jeff Fairbrother and his colleagues who I've interviewed on the podcast. They're trying to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of what about external focus of attention is beneficial, and maybe when are the times when internal, right? We're never going to know that if we keep doing just the basic balanced studies, right? We need to focus on one more than the other. So that's really what I'm trying to do, right? And, I will try to talk about some other sides of the coin, right? And, for example, if you're interested in the kind of information processing internal models view of skill, there's a really interesting looking paper by Daniel Wolpert's group in Nature that just came out. It's titled Contextual Interference Underlies the Learning of Sensorimotor Repertoires. It's really interesting looking. I've kind of just skimmed it, and I'll review it because I want to kind of illustrate. It's a good example. This is the peak of information processing work, right? Daniel Wolpert's. It doesn't get any better than that, right? It's very, very detailed and well thought out. And so I want to use that as to talk about some of the reasons why I have a different view, right? Because I think instead of, you definitely can't use a straw man complaint there because this is a fully formed model, right? So if you're interested, and I would encourage you to check it out. And as I said, I will review it in an upcoming episode. The link's in the show notes. So this balance issue, right? I know a lot of people are interested in I think balance and talking about both sides because underlying it, they have a motivation to integrate the theories, right, and combine them. And I totally get that motivation, right? Why not take the best of both worlds, and why not get the best instead of fighting, battling out? Why don't we take the best of both worlds? They both seem to have their pros and cons and their strengths and limitations. Why don't they provide them? Well, and that's why some people might want me to talk about both. But as I said before, I fundamentally do not believe that we can integrate the theories, right? And I've done a bunch of presentations on my YouTube channel if you're interested in, the basic one, the two skill acquisition theories. There's a couple of papers, the links in the show notes, that have tried to integrate the two theories, and I've reviewed those on my YouTube channels as well. One involving Keith Davids and Digby Elliott, for example. There's a well-known paper. So I've reviewed those, and if you want to know why I don't believe we can integrate the theories, why that's not a fruitful avenue, then I think they're in, and you can have a look in there. And one of the issues that I keep raising, and one of the reasons that I've shifted in the direction of ecological dynamics, dynamical systems, is because, in my view, most information processing models, mental models, whatever you want to call them, including my own that I came up with baseball. Look at my baseball paper where I talk about inhibiting a swing, right? I developed a full model. It essentially ignores motor control, right? They don't, as I said in my book, what a lot of these models do is treat our body like an Xbox controller, right? We do some complex processing, Bayes models, whatever, internal models, then we just move, right? We press the A button that makes us do a forehand stroke, right? For me, I find that completely unsatisfying, and that's why I've shifted, right? And so if you're interested in integration, you have a look at those. I'm happy to talk about more kind of things like that and balance. But the one way that I really want to try to pursue, another reason that I don't want to keep doing here's information processing, here's ecological approach, is because it's been done before, right? There's tons of interesting articles out there if you want to contrast the basic ideas. For example, if you want to understand the difference between an affordance and a mental model, the strengths and weaknesses, I posted again in the show notes, Fodor and Pollution is a great article challenging Gibson's ideas, and Turvey has a response to it. Similarly, that's in the early 80s. If you move later in the 80s into the 90s, look at the interactions between Richard Schmidt, who invented the motor program, and Carl Newell, obviously from Constraints, right? Look at those interactions. Again, the link in the show notes I've talked a bit about on the podcast before. They have a lot of the material. If you're really interested in understanding the basics and what those strengths and weaknesses are and contrasting and comparing them, I cannot possibly do a better job than those people, right? Those are some of the most intelligent and well-knowledged people in the field. So I don't want to try to rehash that. What I want to try to do more of a balance is I want to get into talking about the work and having them on the podcast of the people, excuse me, that I call the skeptical believers, right? In particular, I'll highlight Use Dessing and Rajiv Raghunathan, who I have had on the podcast a few times, right? Both of these researchers, I'm sure they would tell you they align with the ecological approach. They align with ecological psychology, dynamical systems. But both of them, what they're trying to do is tease apart and unpack the ideas, right? They're not taking the ideas at gospel, which frustrates, I think, a lot of people. Eust has done a lot of work, for example, on prospective control. Prospective control, the idea that we control our actions by just coupling to information. Eust has done some great work on interception tasks and catching tasks to show, maybe there's more to the story than that. That story is oversimplified, and it's a bit more complex. Rajiv has done some great work on variability, right? And the idea that we kind of paint in the ecological approach that movement variability is all good and it's great, exploring and searching, it's all wonderful. His work has started to challenge some of these ideas, showing that it's not always good. He's trying to understand when and how it's good. And for example, he has a really interesting new paper where he looked at kids doing one of his tasks in his studies and showing kids are actually, that seems from my interpretation of his results, are that kids have a natural inherent tendency to want to explore and search for different movement patterns, which is great if we let them, but they also don't do it in a very efficient way, right? They don't, in his model, they don't take into account task relevant variability. And so that for me highlights why we don't just let kids play, right? We need to impose constraints to guide their search, right? So I think there's some great work. So he's trying to kind of challenge and unpack the idea that variability is good, right? What I think. So, and there's also, in my early career, I kind of did the same thing. When I started, everyone was all about tau, right? Time to collision tau, David Lee's work and all the people that followed. And I kind of challenged some of the idea that's all just based on image size, right? And particular, I'll talk about this on the podcast at some point. I brought in the idea, well, what about binocular information from our two eyes? But anyway, so these kind of things that are actually not so much comparing the ecological approach versus the information processing approach, but actually trying to unpack the ecological approach and challenging some of the specific ideas. For me, that's a much more fruitful avenue to follow than talking about affordances versus mental models, right? They're completely different, incompatible views, right? They can only get so far by comparing and contrasting them. So that's what I want to do on the podcast in the future. And if you have any ideas, I'm more than willing to listen to people, what they'd like to hear more about on the podcast. Of course, I'm interested in. This is also, partially, I only have so many hours in the day to read stuff, right? And look at new papers. And of course, I'm more interested in certain topics, right? I don't really want to read another neuroscience study where they had people moving through force fields, moving a joystick through force fields. That's not appealing to me. I'd much rather read another small-sided games paper, right? I'm biased, right? But going back to what people said, it's my podcast, right? So it reflects my interests and my views. But hopefully I'm not too biased or unbalanced in the material. But as I say this, there's been a little, if those are on Twitter, there's been a very often heated and not very nice discussion at some points, but it seems to have led to something good, right? And, I think it seems like we're organizing some podcast debates between people with different views and roundtable discussions, which I think could be, if we do them in the right way, I think they can be really beneficial, right? And, this, maybe the last point I'll end on today, right? There's one episode of our kind of group discussion on the journal clubs that I sunk down to the level that I don't like to get into, where I was making fun and kind of ridiculing people's beliefs about their fundamental beliefs about skill and things like that. And, I compared it to religion, I think. I think I expressed in the next episode, but I'll do it again. I regret the way that I kind of sinking down to that level. And there's no real need for that. And where this is science and, we're all passionate about helping people learn, right? And help people get more skillful, right? Sometimes that leads to a dark, unhealthy place where people are getting very personal and attacking each other. There's no need for that, right? And I apologize for my contribution for that. I think most of the time I don't do that, right? It's not in my personality at all. For those that know me, I just kind of got frustrated and let things come out. So I definitely will try to avoid that in the future. Keep avoiding that in the future. But I did want to mention that. Let's keep it professional, interesting. There's so many interesting things to discuss, right? Even if you disagree, being critical and challenging ideas is good, right? That's how science moves forward. You just have to do it in the right way. The other thing I would say, I just wanted the last thing, I see sometimes on Twitter people challenging people's credentials. I put up this with my whole career. Oh, you're not a coach, or you didn't play at a high level. You'd have nothing useful to say. Let's get rid of that. Measuring, credentials against each other, right? If you fundamentally don't believe that someone who didn't coach has anything useful to say about coaching, then I think I don't understand why you'd follow me or be interested in sports science. 99% of the people that do sports science never coached, right? So. I don't understand that view. And the same, the people that are steeped in academia that don't take into account coaches' experiences, experiential knowledge and things, which I don't, So I think both sides, that's important. Let's stop with you have to have this to be able to say anything meaningful. That's nonsense, right? Judge people by what they say, not their resume. That's silly. So So that's kind of some of the off the top of my head ramblings about some of the things I've been thinking about lately. As I said, we'll have some interesting things coming up in the finish off the year on the podcast. So I hope you have a good end to the year, and I hope you keep enjoying the content. And as I said, any feedback about kind of these issues I've been talking about today, or reviews of my book, I would greatly appreciate. So thanks for listening, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.